Matt gave a title to this presentation, Franklin's Stroke of Genius. And I thought about that for a minute. If you have a life of genius, what would the stroke of genius be? Well, that's a good thing to look into. When all of you pursue your studies, which hopefully are ongoing or periodical, you will see in some of the great personalities of history certain moments, probably, certain maybe extended moments. It could be more than just one flash. Maybe it could be a period of days or even a whole year or something, but a certain point at which a great person has come to a conception that changes things, changes their own outlook and changes the world. So I'm going to mention a few things about Franklin and show how, just to keep in mind as I go through this presentation, which is not going to be primarily about Franklin, but about, you could say, about his legacy. And in each of these things, you might want to look for, in studying him, just like you would study a scientist who came up with some creative breakthrough. When did he or how did he decide on or come up with this? What was the great insight that he had at a certain point? So here are some things that Franklin was the leader of. The Industrial Revolution in England, on the scene for 18 years and guiding the people who made the great breakthroughs in England. We talked about that in another discussion. The alliance with monarchist France that helped America win the revolution against the British Empire. And Franklin personally inspired the common purpose of the two countries. Despite the previous hostility of the American settlers to France, to the Jesuits and to the monarchical government of France. So all of a sudden, these are not a barrier. What we complained about, their religion or their government, that's not a barrier to being friends and to having a common purpose. And it's very important to keep this in mind. Franklin also was the founder of the city of Philadelphia's greatness as the world capital of progress. Franklin was, in many respects, the founder of the modern study of electricity. His own experiments, his own hypothesis about negative and positive electricity, and his starting up of relations and institutions to continue that study. This is his electricity for the world is his legacy. He was also the leading personality in America promoting the abolition of slavery in the very beginning of the American Republic. And then finally, all of these things bear on what he did as the greatest figure putting together the founding mission of the American nation, which is both nationhood and progress, so national sovereignty and progress. And the two things go hand in hand. He created the American Philosophical Society, which was the first group of people across all the colony, uniting all the colonies, and they were promoting development of the country and science. He had a plan for a union of the colonies 20 years before the revolution, the Albany Plan of Union. He was postmaster in the colonial days and made all kinds of provisions to make people intelligent using that. get them intelligence. And then on the eve of our formation of a government, he was instrumental in establishing the program of our government, which was protectionism and industrial progress. So keep these things in mind as we get into this story. What I'm going to do here is to give you some sense of the outline of my book, but also I'm going to concentrate on something that is going to be in the second volume, period after the American Civil War.
Excellent.
There were 4 presidencies which had a profound inspiration and impact on the whole world, American presidencies. First of all, the founding, the revolution, and the administration and the person of George. Then Abraham Lincoln and his struggle, Franklin Roosevelt and John Kennedy. I'm going to go through all of them, but I'm going to give a special reference to Lincoln and what followed. George Washington, in his farewell address, given just before he left office after his second term, this address used to be recited every year in the US Congress and the Senate. He warned Americans about not falling into a terrible trap that would destroy everything. The first trap was, do not attach yourself to any foreign nation or foreign interests. And do not make any foreign country your enemy. Either one of them is fatal. It's fatal to our republic, and it would be a disaster for the world. He also warned Americans not to be the dupes of anyone that would try to get them to work for the breaking up of the Union, to put one section of the country against the other. This is also about foreign policy, not just a warning about Southern fanatics. Because what is it when some country favors a split-off group within another country, or a revolt within another country? It's insane, it's wrong. And Washington, our founding president, warned and was proven right by all succeeding American history. He warned against these things. All right, so the result of the American Revolution and Washington's own immense presence in it was completely new prospects for the world. The Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the orderly establishment of a republic, and the program of Hamilton, which had been the program of Franklin for industrial progress. This was all throughout the world. Everybody knew about this who was in public life. It was not until the next generation that the program was actually put through industrialization by Henry Clay and Biddle and people like that. But these people in the 1820s were the heirs of Franklin. They were all related back to the Revolution. They admired Washington, and they renewed the program of the founders. And this continued the legacy and the impact of the revolution in the world. The next, after that, there was a terrible period of 30 years of Southern domination. Then we had a war, 1861 to 65. Abraham Lincoln's presidency, his personal image for the world as a man of mercy, was something that the world saw, and they were shocked into reviewing all of this when he was murdered coincidentally with the ending of the Civil War. So this great shock of America's struggle and Lincoln's victory and then his murder, he gave a farewell address also. I mean, he didn't intend it as such, but it was his second inaugural address. And I've got it right here. Let's see if I've got it. Well, maybe, yes, here it is. Okay. And I want you to, I'm going to read this part to you, and you have to understand this not as rhetoric, but as a law. That Lincoln said, this is America's program, and this is what has to be done. And this is deadly serious. This is not rhetoric, okay? With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for the veterans, and to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. That is America's legitimate and historic policy. It means that you are binding up your own country and finishing the work that he was in, was not only winning the war, but making sure that we build up the United States in its living standards, its power and its capabilities. And then a lasting peace, a just and lasting peace with all nations. I'm going to get back to this in a minute. So then Franklin Roosevelt, you can't say he gave a farewell address, because his whole last period of when he was leading the country in World War II was dealing with the post-war world. Some of these are put into succinct things like the four freedoms. He founded the United Nations. He insisted that 4 countries ought to police the world together as nations, powerful nations: the United States, Britain, Russia, and China. And there were screams and howls from various people in power on both sides of the Atlantic about this, but this was US policy. It wasn't a world government. It just said, we're going to forbid the wars. We have to have a new era. And it was based on the idea of justice. And what's justice? Not revenge. Yeah, you're going to have a war crimes trial, but that's not justice. Justice is doing what's right for the people who are survivors, so that you honor those who have been abused and murdered, and you have a future, you have survival. So that's what the world was to be based on. The development of Africa and the Middle East and Latin America and so forth, ending the empires. The Atlantic Charter, the agreement between US and Britain, was based on this idea, even though Churchill didn't like it. The best third world leaders, that is, leaders of African and Arab nationalism, and China and others, the best of them took direct inspiration from FDR, notably Ghana's president Kwame Nkrumah and Nelson Mandela in South Africa, the best leaders in China, and so forth. Another leader of the second generation, but who is reflecting Roosevelt, just like the 1820s guys reflected the revolution. Another leader of the next generation from Roosevelt was John F. Kennedy, who was a war hero with in World War II with Franklin Roosevelt as his commander. And he himself personally chose Roosevelt's point of view, this founding American revolutionary point of view, instead of his own father's muddle-headed reactionary policy and ideas. The impact of both of these men, Roosevelt and Kennedy, in the world is absolutely incalculable, continues today. I'm reading a wonderful book you ought to note down. I just bought it for about $4, a hardbound book. It's called Roosevelt and Stalin by Susan Butler. You like that, right? It's a wonderful book so far. I mean, it's just fantastic. But just note this, Kennedy, in his proposal for a space program for the United States, proposed that the United States and the Soviet Union work together, and that he proposed that the first moon landing should be a shared project of both countries. It didn't happen that way, but we did get into cooperation with them over time on the space program. However, if you look back at the origination of the space, mankind's space program, the two countries who founded the space capabilities for the human race were Russia and America. So it in a sense it was joined, and it became coupled. So keep in mind that idea, sort of a legacy of Franklin and of the revolution, the impact of a positive program favoring the aspirations, the independence and sovereignty of other countries and their great progress, because they used the US as the best of the US as a good example. I want to go back to America at the close of the Civil War. We had a pretty rotten president that succeeded Lincoln after his murder, Andrew Johnson, who had been put on the ticket as a vice presidential candidate to get the southern border states to go along and vote for Lincoln. So he's from Kentucky, but he wasn't good as a president. And we were starting to do some things, but it really got going once he was gone, and the next president, General Grant, became president in 1869 after the expiration of what would have been Lincoln's second term. And so what I'm going to discuss here is things that were largely accomplished or set in motion in a short period from starting about 1869 into the 1870s. First of all, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869, the first one. After that, there were, and at the same time that was being completed, there were vast other plans, almost incomprehensible vast plans by the United States, and particularly by people who were the strongest backers of Lincoln. And they were they were especially based in Philadelphia as the continuation of the set of institutions and companies and public institutions set up by Franklin and his heirs, and even by his family. The center of this was the Pennsylvania Railroad Company. And There was also the Franklin Institute, a public benefit institute in Philadelphia. There was the University of Pennsylvania. There were a number of specialty companies in machine tools. And then there was the personality, Henry C. Carey, the son of Matthew Carey, who featured heavily in my first book. He was an economist, and he had been advising Lincoln. Lincoln undoubtedly read his work and referred to him for economic policy. This is a group of nationalists, of progressive nationalists. They're also at the center of the fight against the slave owners. They are completely opposed to Wall Street as a group. And they accomplished massive things. Much of what they tried to do was destroyed or squelched or taken over and shut down. But some of the things that they accomplished created the modern world. So first of all, can we get that map? Let's get the map of the United States. Here you see, let's see. I guess this is, yeah, this shows before the building of the transcontinental railroads, I guess. This is an 1859 map. So 10 years later, at the end of the Civil War, the US completed a railroad from the Midwest to San Francisco Bay, the first transcontinental railroad. And then the second transcontinental railroad was being built by the Pennsylvania Railroad and their associates in Philadelphia, and with the help, some help from Germany. Or just leave it, no, just leave it at that map, that's okay. So the second transcontinental railroad, the Northern Pacific, was to go from the west side of Lake Superior, which you see up there at the top of the lakes. It's the westernmost and northernmost lake. So from the western tip of that, it was to go out across the northern plains out to Washington State, to Seattle, to the Bay. And there was constant reference in the plans to developing both Canada's plains and US plains, and linking up with Japan and China and India and Russia across the Pacific. The idea there was it was one of the ways that we were going to develop and populate the West with 100 million people, with cities and farms. The plans for getting into Asia and developing that relationship, I'll talk about in a minute. There was also a petroleum industry in Pennsylvania that was started up by independent people, but they were encouraged by Pennsylvania's, central outlook of progress. And as soon as the industry was started on a small scale, the Pennsylvania Railroad took it up and made it into a major industry. The Pennsylvania Railroad supplied rail lines to carry the stuff. They invented the kind of rail cars, the tank cars, pipelines. They set up a subsidiary called the Empire Transportation Company. And they had a fleet of steamers on the lakes to transport oil as well. They had other steamers run by the Pennsylvania Railroad going all through the Great Lakes, some of them to go out to Lake Superior and connect up to the Northern Pacific Railroad, which they were building. That was a national railroad. You got to keep this in mind now. This is America's railroad. The money for this, the resources came from the federal government, but it was being developed by private people who were doing it to build up the United States. They made money off of it, but it was a political adventure to build up civilization. Among the most prominent boats in the fleet that they had going out to Lake Superior were three that were called the India, the China, and the Japan. I'll get back to that in a minute. Keep that in mind. That's what's in their mind. Then there was another railroad that was to go from Texas to Los Angeles or San Diego. It was called the Texas Pacific. It was being developed by Tom Scott and other executives of the Pennsylvania Railroad. At the same time, the Pennsylvania Railroad was building railroads all throughout the South. They had just been brought back into the Union. Black people were running several of the governments at the outset right after the Civil War, particularly South Carolina and Mississippi, among others. The black leaders who had freedom and were given the right to seek power brought in public schools. And there were white people who wanted to transform the South. And those people reached out to the Pennsylvania Railroad and to the nationalists in the North and said, we don't want to be with the Democrats anymore, with these Northern Democrats. They don't care about us. What we want to do is change the South. And so they were building up railroads in the South, and they were trying to build this railroad from Texas out to the Pacific. They also had a program to build up harbors and everything to modernize the South. This became the subject of a great conflict associated with the 1876 election. I'm not going to get into that now, but that was the program. Go back to this map again, can you? Then there were let's have the world map. Okay. You see where Japan is. The United States aided the revolution in Japan that occurred in the late 1860s, the Meiji Restoration, to bring in a modern government, and then aided Japan in developing modern industry to make them a great power. And this was done largely through the intervention of the people from Philadelphia. Again, Baldwin locomotives, particularly Henry Carey and his philosophy of protectionism, national sovereignty, progress. Japan was transformed in a flash into a modern country. They're a genius country. Russia, not through the Pacific, but of course through our connections to them diplomatically and militarily, was given tremendous aid by the United States, and Russia gave aid to our country at several points during the 19th century. There was mutual aid, so we were contributing greatly. So in 1872 rather, a delegation from Japan came to Philadelphia representing the Emperor of Japan to work out a program for development of Japan directly with a $15 million loan from the bankers of the railroads and these guys in Philadelphia, Jay Cook. At the same time, the same year, the Tsar sent his son, the Grand Duke Alexis, to America, and the Pennsylvania Railroad took him around the whole country. Yep. Keep in mind, this railroad company, which is the largest company in the country, was anti-Wall Street and was a leader of progress in the country. It was a private company whose president at this point, Tom Scott, had been Assistant Secretary of War for Lincoln. So it's always been a quasi-public institution. So then you had Germany, whose leader Bismarck was profoundly inspired by Lincoln and by the American victory in the Union victory in the Civil War. And he gradually changed the conception of the hegemonic conception in Germany towards building up making Germany a major power, which was sovereign and which would play a very distinguished role in the world, aside from German culture, which always had been that. It was then in the later 1870s that Bismarck's policy was directly shifted to protectionism by a party, a very small political party that was based on Henry Carey personally, the Philadelphia guy. Germany changed overnight into rising towards being the greatest power in Europe, with great industries, great science. They had some African colony, but they were not an imperialistic nation. They were going towards internal development and towards benefiting mankind with their own development. The United States had terrific intervention in China to try to change the damage that had been done to China's people by imperialism, including by rotten people in America who went over there in the period when the slave owners controlled our government in the 1840s. And they followed on the British Opium War and imposed an unequal treaty on China. So now Lincoln sent an ambassador, Anson Burlingame, to China, who was dedicated to repairing this insult and injury and outrage of the Western powers against China. And he worked so well with them and with a group called the self-strengthening movement. The self-strengthening movement in the middle of the 19th century, led by Prince Kung, sometimes K-U-N-G or G-O-N-G. I just look up Prince Kung. And he was the reference for this American policy. And they worked out a whole new arrangement with China. The US was to help them develop, and they were going to have their absolute sovereignty. Since the US became so powerful in its military and industrial might from the Civil War on, the British and French and other powers had to respect America's point of view, and now it favored China being left alone to open themselves up as they saw fit to the rest of the world and be friends with people instead of being preyed upon. They sent this same man, this American, back to America as China's ambassador to the United States, Anson Burlingame. And they made a treaty in 1868. And he gave a brilliant address, in New York about what this is all about. And the Philadelphia people played him up, the Philadelphia nationalists, and said, this is our policy for China. that they are to be treated with respect. This is a third of the world. They have things to teach us from their ancient, all of the inventions that have been only improved on in the rest of the world. We have to be, the two countries have to work together. This Philadelphia railroad and political group also sponsored the career and successes and achievements of the inventor Thomas Edison. He was a brilliant, inventive worker in many ways. Before they intercepted him, he was working for Western Union Telegraph Company in New York, which was a monopoly in the telegraph business. And the Morgan and his allies were more and more in control of that and everything else. So the Pennsylvania Railroad people, a particular man named William J. Palmer, who was one of the leaders, he was developing the railroads in both Colorado and Mexico. He built the National Railways of Mexico. And he was building up Colorado for this group. So he set up a company to go against the monopoly of Western Union in the telegraph business to help their railroads, right? You need telegraphs on the railroad. And so that company was headed by his assistant, the railroad assistant, Edward Johnson, in New York. And they hired Edison away from these other Wall Street guys, equipped him, financed him, built him up. He started inventing one thing after another. And then another guy, and there's a wonderful letter from Palmer to Edison, General Palmer. He was General Palmer because this Philadelphia Railroad guy, Palmer, building up Colorado and Mexico, had also been a Civil War general fighting in Alabama. He led a cavalry group and got the Medal of Honor, capturing an entire regiment of slaveholder soldiers. So he sent a letter to Edison, to his assistant out in New York, back from Colorado over there about Edison. He said, I think this is when Edison invented the phonograph. And he said, please tell Edison that it looks like he's beaten Aladdin. Could invent anything he wants. And please ask him if he could invent me a way to build a railroad without money. Because they were broke. They had been, at that point, they had been largely bankrupted by the Wall Street gangsters. When Edison started to work on his major inventions, his science was starting to be advised by the research scientist for the Franklin Institute named George Barker, and who took him out, actually made him famous, took him down to Washington, did publicity for his phonograph, many inventive ways. And then he took him out on a trip to the West, and it was an astronomy observation of a solar eclipse that Edison was testing some scientific instruments. And this guy, Barker, suggested that Edison ought to work on electricity, which Barker was an expert on, and inspired him to go for broke. And Edison soon was able to make a press conference and say, I'm going to light up the entire world and change the world. And he did. In Pennsylvania and their allies put together. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? It's unstable here.
Yeah,
Can you still hear me?
we can hear
Hello?
you. Yes, Anton, we can hear you.
Okay. So they had a centennial exposition in 1876. One of the people who came was put on by this group in Philadelphia, celebrating 100 years of U.S. independence. And two great personalities who came there from Europe were Emil Rathenau, who was interested in science development, and guy who made the Mendeleev, the chemist who invented the periodic table from Russia. Emil Rathenau was inspired by this place, this centennial, and Barker and these other guys met him in Paris a few years later and set up a partnership with Edison. They created the German Edison Company, which became the AAG Company of Germany. And between Edison and Rathenau, they brought power and electricity to half of the world, including Russia, which was supplied by Rathenau's company. His son Walter Rathenau was the the foreign minister of Germany in 1922. That had a brief period of working with the Russians of the Soviet Union for peace, and he was assassinated by fascists. A very famous family. So this was. So let's sum up what this group accomplished. They started to build up the power of the United States. They accomplished building up petroleum, which was taken over by Rockefeller, but it continued to develop because they had a solid basis already. Electricity. There was no electricity without what was done by Edison and his sponsors. And the sponsors was not Wall Street, which tried to stop him. Whatever you read, if it says that Morgan backed Edison, and that's the impression you get, then what you're reading is from Morgan, almost more or less directly, and from the British, not from any American. So they developed electricity, petroleum, the first great steel mills in America. There were none before the Civil War, before the high tariffs, before this group went in with Carnegie as a partner. Mass production, the steel mills and other things. And then Henry Ford, who had worked as a manager of Edison's plant in Detroit and was Edison's special friend, and in many ways continued the legacy of Edison. There was a lot wrong with him and with other people in this group later on. Many of them went off the track towards the end of the 19th century. Carnegie became an Anglo-Saxon racist in many ways. Edison got cranky in many ways. It's irrelevant because what they did as a movement, this happened to Japan. Japan went off the track of being this great inspiration to the world and this great genius country into militarism and insanity. The same thing happened in Germany. Russia went insane in the early 20th century after being attacked by the British-Japanese combination and anarchists who were working for the aristocracy in Russia. And the United States went insane, right? With Teddy Roosevelt, with the war against Spain, with an alliance with King Edward VII, all of these things. But before that, the United States, led by this initiative of brilliant humanists, people believing in the not only the dignity but the unbelievably ambitious future of the world, accomplished real miracles. This was done in many ways, again, by Franklin Roosevelt. Technologically, I would point to just two items there, among many others, but these two in particular. The extension of electricity to the common person. farmers didn't have electricity in America by and large. Roosevelt brought it to them. The Tennessee Valley Authority wasn't just to build up the South the way the Pennsylvania Railroad before was trying to do. It didn't transform it from backwardness and stupidity and racism into modern times where people are more interested in having good jobs and being successful than just being, I'm better than you, even though I'm a pig and I have nothing. That was the old attitude of the poor people in the South. So the Tennessee Valley Authority was also visited and seen by all of the leading thinkers around the world, or they sent representatives. China, Africans, Kwame Nkrumah was in the US for 10 years. And then later on, he and Kennedy built the Great Dam on the Volta River to get hydroelectricity in industrialized West Africa. And then the other thing was nuclear power, nuclear science, nuclear energy. This arose in the project, the Manhattan Project, to develop the atomic bomb. So you could say, okay, this was for a sinister purpose, or a purpose connected with winning the war by intimidating the other side. There was not necessarily an intention to use the bomb by Roosevelt. But leaving that aside, it's another discussion. The fact is that it was understood before this project started that there was infinite potential in nuclear science, that there's hundreds of times as much energy in uranium as there is in wood, and many, many times as much energy as in coal and oil. So this is a much better and less polluting source of energy, which has the capability of uniting mankind to accomplish things. I would refer you all to a not too long ago documentary film called Pandora's Promise. You can get it on the internet. Pandora's Promise. It's I think 2013 documentary, and it's put on by environmentalists who believe in global warming as a crisis, and so on and so forth, but they are people who have changed their view towards nuclear power. They used to be against it. Now they've looked into it and found that all of the anti-nuclear point of view, I'm talking about being against nuclear energy, not bombs, that's different. But they become pro-nuclear energy. And this just completely refutes all the fears. All of the opposition to nuclear power is based on irrational fear. If it's not based on a deadly idea that mankind should not exist, and mankind should be largely wiped out without energy, without modern living conditions. And sometimes it's based on that, and they don't talk about that, they just make up stuff against nuclear power. Kennedy had nuclear power as his program for the world. Build power plants all over the world and make them for desalinating seawater. Do that between Israel and the Arabs, between other enemies, Pakistan and India, US and Russia, US and Mexico. Desalinate seawater, bring electricity everywhere, and use the waste product from the plants in reprocessing, use it as fuel. And then, of course, the other thing was the space program with its infinite potential. And I need to personally learn more. But for doing this book, I'm going to need to learn all of the outcomes of the space program in terms of technology, miniaturization. I know about some of the other things that we've gotten in medicine and so forth, but I've got to know more about this. But a good deal of what we accomplished later on came from the space program, as well as from some military things that were done in the Cold War, but largely as a result of this spectacular enterprise, which was in line with all of these other earlier enterprises by the United States when it was a great country. So let me leave it at that, and we can ask some questions. I've given you an outline of the second volume of the book, as well as going back to the first one.
Yeah, thank you, Anton, very much. And indeed, I probably should have written a different title, and I think I had aimed to do that, but it didn't work out. But nonetheless, the spirit of Ben Franklin was very clearly animating every single section of this history that you went through. So anybody who has a question, I recommend putting your name in the chat room or the chat box, and I'll call upon you. Oh, we have Stephen, who has a thought and or question to throw at you.
All right, thanks. Anton, thank you for a wonderful lecture, illuminating as always. I have a number of questions. I'll focus on one, and it relates to kind of the Philadelphia group and the general philosophy of improving mankind with industry, and particularly how they brought Edison in and kind of unleashed his creative talents. I know Tesla was a contemporary, and because I have a military background, I tend to see things a little differently. And I'm thinking of this kind of alleged black program that is thought to exist in the US ostensibly since World War II. I'm wondering if it's possible that sort of this Philadelphia influence group, if they may have looked at some of the potential for technology and realized that it could be misused by people. And is it possible that the origins of the US black world, for lack of a better term, predate the Second World War, and that there were a hidden apparatus for scientific research with good intent that was maintained? Has any of your research kind of led you down that track or opened up that possibility?
I'm not sure I understand the question. I mean, I don't think that there was, I think that you need to, I mean, what I know about the greatest accomplishments of our society, particularly of the United States and in the modern era. I don't know of any sinister use of technology aside from the obvious, which is to make war and to burn and bomb and kill people en masse. That's a sinister use of man's capabilities. It's an evil use of man's capabilities. I'll point you to a statement made by this guy, General Palmer, this one who hired Edison. He was a Quaker in Pennsylvania, and those people were opposed to war, any war. They opposed the American Revolution, a lot of them. Some of them, left, came out for the revolution anyway and served. Palmer was conflicted. He said he actually formed his own regiment and went into war and was completely effective in the war, but he wrote to his best friend, I believe fervently that Jesus commands us to love our neighbor and not to kill our fellow human being. That's a law. I also am moved by my conscience to defend the Union, the American Union, which if it fails, if it's broken, will cause terrible suffering to the people. And I have followed my conscience in this case, but I have not resolved this. I am still troubled by this. I am not easy about it. I still believe that it's wrong to kill people. Period. You could say it's always wrong to kill people. In my view, you have to keep that attitude. If you ever lose that part of your conscience that you're born with that says you should not kill another human being, you're dehumanizing yourself. So that you need to be troubled not only about your own killing of somebody, which everybody is, but also about any murder, any killing, any unnecessary death of human beings. So that certainly was the philosophy of this whole group and of all of the great leaders of our country. Every one of them, the ones that I mentioned, had a wartime, you know, they were outstanding leaders in war. They're famous, right? Washington with the Revolution, Lincoln, the Civil War, FDR, World War II, and Kennedy, also World War II, not as president. But they also were leaders for peace and for the crisis of mankind, you know, in every time is, can we get away from this use of our brilliance as a species to kill people and destroy ourselves? War is suicide for our species. It's always suicide. You're killing your fellow human being. So I think that there's a misconception about war in our era, and that that you could safely concentrate on the technicalities of war. And that there's somehow that somebody else or you sometime in your life have sorted out and settled the issue of, is this a crime, a terrible, terrible crime and mistake, an oh my God kind of mistake and crime, or isn't it? That's not settled. And it is the most imbecilic, fatal way of thinking to avoid that now, when the US and Russia have 90% of the nuclear weapons in the world and missiles and bombers pointed at each other 24 hours a day. So that's the way I want to answer that. I don't know about, I mean, there were, starting in the late, I don't want to take too long on this, but there was obviously in the later 1800s, a movement in Britain and America, particularly among British scientists and people in academia, connected especially to Edward VII, later King Edward VII, to set up a dark, evil philosophy on purpose. That, you know, knowing that it was evil, and that's what they wanted to do, because that would help them strategically, because they had to cope with this onslaught of Germany, Russia, Japan, all these great countries coming out to do wonderful things and lead humanity away from the power of this set of aristocrats and bankers. So they came up with this thing that became fascism. And there was certain science aspects to it, including what they made out of Darwinism. Anyway, that's as much as I would want to say.
Thank you.
Okay, we have a question from Reynald, who says that his mic is giving him a hard time. Now, Reynald, I suggest try it out, and if we can't hear your question, then I'll read it to Anton. Are you there, Reynald?
Yeah, sure. Is it all right? Could you hear me well?
Yeah, it's
if
okay.
You speak clearly.
I'll try to speak a little louder. Is it better? Okay. Now, I just wanted to find out, Tony, if you ever encounter any kind of network in the Catholic Church who actually were working with, with all of these pro-science persons. Have you ever encountered any of those guys anywhere?
Specifically in the Catholic Church is what you're asking, who worked with Kennedy or de Gaulle or Daniel Johnson or others.
That's right, yes.
On progress. Yeah.
Are you talking about in the 20th century?
Yeah, but mostly from what I can see, some of them were in the 20th century, but I have no idea if there were any before per se. Some probably, I know here in Quebec, obviously, because, Quebec was Catholic, but, at other places, especially in the U.S., obviously the U.S. Catholic Church, I don't know what the history is over there per se. Now, any good things, I'm not talking about the bad ones.
I don't know. I haven't had much reference to looking at the religious aspect, except people that were critical of, some missionaries and, and some of them highly critical of Protestant church. And I know in the 19th century, there was a couple of scientists in France that were instrumental in the development of the whole world. Arago is among them, but not specific reference to the Catholic Church. No, I can't. I don't know how to answer that. Maybe we should talk more privately, and you could give me some leads, and we could get into some work on that. If you're talking about people in Canada, or people in, like in French Canada or in the US, I don't know.
Well, if you look at Kennedy per se, right? Kennedy was Catholic. I don't know if any of the networks were actually associated with the progress that he was trying to bring forward. Same thing for De Gaulle, or I don't know. I mean, that was my question anyway. We can get that privately if you want, no problem.
You have to educate me on the subject. I may have known something about this in the past, but it's
can I throw one little tidbit out?
Go ahead.
When I was doing a bit of research some years ago, I was going through the eugenics reviews from the 40s. And it was, like a popular science thing. It still wasn't seen as that all that bad. Even after Hitler won, there were still, people openly espousing eugenics without any shame. And this eugenics review was a really big publication to coordinate policy on sterilization laws in Europe and North America. And one of the complaints made by one of the authors in an editorial was the pain in the ass that the Quebec Catholics were giving them, because they were the most active political grouping who were deploying activists all the way down to Illinois, Kentucky, all the time to lobby and block these eugenics laws from passing. And they were like, they're such a thorn in our side. And they were very frustrated with that, like, Quebec Catholic machine that was capable of doing that all over the continent, which I think led into such a concentrated attack and extraction of Christianity from Quebec in the late 50s, early 60s. There was a definite, they thought that through on how do we cripple that, break it, and bring in a new sort of technocratic governing structure with the Quiet Revolution. So that's something as a lead, just throwing out there. As far as like pro-scientific progress, I know it's there. As I'm sure you Reynald and Anton know that it must be there, but I haven't seen it exactly yet where. So, but that's definitely worth following up on.
When Germany changed to industrial progress and, building up Social Security and the living standards under Bismarck, it was accomplished by agreement with the Vatican. The new Pope, Leo XIII, replaced this horribly confused and mentally degenerated guy, Pius IX, and who was stuck in some fearful Dark Age reaction to Masons and everything else. And so anyway, the Germans had an attack going on against the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Party in Germany was not very good. Most political parties aren't any good anyway. But then the Pope came in, this new Pope, and Bismarck worked out a complete, wonderful arrangement. He had the philosophy of the rights of the workers, the rights of the people, and so that was the whole political situation shifted dramatically, and they went ahead with this progress. So I know that the Catholic Church was targeted by Hitler, largely because of this legacy of promoting the progress of mankind. It's not a negative thing. In this case, it's an image of man going back to the great founding of the Christian Church. So anyway.
Okay, I've got. Well, Marty said he has something to chime in specifically on this topic. So Marty, then Bob, then Ryan, then Satomi. So Marty, it's all yours.
You did.
Oh, shit.
Is that good?
Yeah.
Okay, now you're open.
Thanks, Anton. You're absolutely right. Now, I just want to confirm and add to a couple of points there. And that is, I think, Matt, once again, you guys have opened up an enormous separate vein of research, which is, I am not Catholic, and I was raised in an atmosphere and spirit of vicious anti-Catholic prejudice in Northern Ireland among the Protestant Unionists. One of my closest friends at school and at Oxford became Minister of Culture in Ian Paisley's Democratic Unionist Party and tried to abolish the teaching of science in favor of imposing 6,000-year creationism. So I actually, my school was infinitely better than that, but that was the environment in society. So I had a long way to come. But you're absolutely right. Leo XIII went on to produce a great encyclical, and I will get it garbled. I stand to be corrected by current and former Catholics here, but it was basically called De Rarum Novarum, about new things, in which he established Christian social democracy, the raising up of workers' rights, the establishment of civilized democratic society based on Christian principles. It was the inspiration for the later Christian democratic political parties after World War II, and actually after World War I as well in Germany. After Leo XIII, you had other great constructive popes. You had Pope Benedict. I always forget whether he was the 14th or the 15th, but at the beginning of World War I, he labors virtually alone to try and prevent the war. He rightly sees the war exactly as you described it, Anton, as an evil insanity and a complete suicide and self-destruction of Western civilization. But beyond this, we then get Pope Pius XI, a very powerful, respected, and admired pope who was almost certainly medically murdered when he was already over 80 years old by Mussolini because of his condemnation of the anti-Semitic and genocidal policies of Nazi Germany. He had already openly condemned them. He was about to condemn them in another encyclical, the first encyclical in history to be produced in German, not in Latin, mit brennenden Sorgen, with burning sorrow, to reach the German people directly. And he died in 1938. But before that, and this is the key point I want to make, and that is a further extension of exactly what you were saying, Anton. Not only did these enlightened Catholic popes over half a century, over 60 years, from 1878 to 1938, make peace with Bismarck and totally support Bismarck's truly enlightened and brilliant social policies in Germany, they did the same thing with FDR in the United States. The Catholic cardinals and bishops in the United States were enormously supportive of FDR, and he showed great courage in embracing them. Why did he show great courage? Because as recently as 1928, Al Smith, who was another figure who became much more reactionary and negative in his later years, rather like Carnegie and the others you delineated so well did. But in 1928, Al Smith, a devout Catholic, up to that point an enlightened reformer as governor of New York State, and an opponent of every form of racism and bigotry, was attacked as the Pope's tool to reimpose the Inquisition in the United States. And it was the most religiously divisive and vicious campaign in American political history. And the Ku Klux Klan, which was reviving in those years, the southern wing of the Democratic Party, fought Smith tooth and nail. And of course, Herbert Hoover, a disaster, and in some respects admirable for his relief work, but in other respects a pretty creepy and very inept individual, becomes president instead. So only 4 years after that, FDR shows enormous courage in making his alliance with the Catholic Church. Now, they're quite quiet about it, but it's enormously strong, and it completely is consistent with what you were saying. The force of the Catholic Church in the 1930s in the United States is thrown behind the New Deal and democratic policies, but this fits exactly what you were saying. This makes them a target of the racist elitists who support the Ku Klux Klan, who include the Ku Klux Klan, who include the British Empire, and who champion eugenics. So Huxley, certainly after World War II, is at the spearhead in Britain of this policy of delegitimizing Catholic Christianity and the teachings of the Catholic faith. And I was at university in the late 60s and 1970s at Oxford, and I can testify that this was an atmosphere, an anti-Christian general atmosphere, and a very specifically targeted anti-Catholic atmosphere that liberal intellectuals, secular elitists focused on. And it always puzzled me. I could never tell why, because I took the liberals at face value in those days. And I believed that they really were good guys. I was naive, and I couldn't understand why they were going at policies and people. And
Marty?
Yes, now I'll finish now. Well put, Matt. But that's the key point. Anton is not only right, but this is a huge area we should extend study on as well through the 1930s and after World War II.
And just a quick note, Marty will be giving next week's lecture as well. So that was a little bit of a teaser for Marty's mind in action. So that'll be exciting next week. Tune in.
I have to challenge one point there, and that is, like Anton, I'll also be focusing on Lincoln, because again, Lincoln is enormous. It's extraordinary. Yeah,
we'll discover that next week. All right, exactly. Anton, do you have any thoughts to throw back at Marty from that?
We had a question from Ryan.
We do.
He said, "Do you mind expanding on the topic of the railroads? When you mentioned that the U.S. had a railroad called India China, what was the logic behind the names?" I'd like to get back to that, because I think it's quite important. It may be a minor aspect of history, the names of these ships. These were freighters, they were steamships on the Great Lakes, run by the Pennsylvania Railroad, and they were sending them out to the western end of the Great Lakes, where they were building a railroad called the Northern Pacific to go from Minnesota out to the West Coast. And there was great action taking place at the same time to build up Russia, China, and Japan. We could not yet interfere with the British in India or the Middle East. We didn't have the reach for that, for there to end this evil domination. But the idea that we had in alliance with the people of Asia was that the Pacific Ocean could be a new center for peaceful commerce and particularly for building up transportation and trade and technology shared among rising peoples. that the people who were at the bottom of the world ought to be rising to the top of the world, not to put other people in the mud, but to be equal powers and to bring completely new things, new insights, new things that were new to the West and to other countries in the world from their ancient cultures and from their new accomplishments. This was the idea. It was seen that the best Americans, wanted to use the development of our West to hook up with Asia. If this were done in the right way, completely, we never did develop our West. We never got 100 million people to live in the Montana, Utah, Nevada, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado. We started getting some big cities there and industry, but it was shut down. We could have brought great irrigation and everything else. If we'd done it, then I don't believe that the American Indians would have been savagely treated the way they were, because the West, after the hegemony of Wall Street and of rotten people in our military towards the end of the early 20th century under Teddy Roosevelt's leadership, what happened in the West was that the West was left in the hands of mining companies, cattle ranchers, and others who were not driven by a vision of mankind's future, but only of private interest, which was opposed to other private interests or public interests. So there was a tragedy. If we had developed our West, I believe there would have been a better chance, actually, for Asia to have successfully developed. Obviously, Japan and later China did develop, but after a great deal of terrible, terrible tragedy. So these boats were named the India, the China, and the Japan. And they were Great Lakes boats in the United States. You couldn't understand that unless you understood what Lincoln and people who were with him were trying to accomplish for the world.
Great. Thank you, Anton. Anton, I just had a quick question regarding.
Ryan, you're very, very faint.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Yeah, the microphone quality is very, very bad. Can you?
Is it better now, maybe?
Try it.
Hello.
Hello. Go ahead.
Okay, great. I'm just going to ask a quick question regarding when you mentioned something regarding the Japanese Revolution in the late 1800s and the U.S.'s role and its development. Do you mind just exploring that topic, expanding on that topic a bit more? How did that development happen, and how did the U.S. actually intervene in that period?
There were two periods here. The first period was at the time of the American Civil War in the 1861 to 65, and then for a few years after that, there was a revolution building up, and by 1869, they accomplished setting up a new regime in Japan. This was called the Meiji Restoration, M-E-I-J-I, I think it is, in our transliteration. And this referred to putting the emperor in charge of Japan. It doesn't sound like a revolution, but in fact it was, because before that, they had powerful barons and aristocrats and knights of various kinds, as in the feudal period of Europe. And there were certain accomplishments in Japan under that old system, but there was not. They were simply reacting against the outside world, which was trying to destroy them, and as they were doing to China. So they defensively maintained a more of a backward society. And so these were modernizers who wanted to have Japan as a culture and as a society rise quickly, benefit themselves from modern technology. There was a similar movement in China. I mentioned the self-strengthening movement, and I think there was a lot of back and forth between the two. This is before the conflict. So this revolt against the warlords, against the barons, against the old samurai, and not samurai, but the shogun and other leaders. This revolt had certain military aspects, and I believe that if more research is done, we would find an important direct connection with the United States, militarily, among other things. I know that one warship that was an American warship that was supposed to be sold to the shogun and people defending him was diverted with American happiness to the revolutionaries. I think other things were done as well. It makes a good deal of sense. What I'm sure about and already know about is that after the Meiji Restoration in 1869, when there was this new government, the people who were influential in Japan were already students of Henry Carey and adherents of different aspects of nationalism in the modern sense, that is, use technology and become a society that is beneficial to your own people and to the world. The idea of you could put it. What is the modern idea of a legitimate government? It's the idea that a nation does not exist for itself. It exists for what it can do for mankind. That's the modern idea. And so Japan wanted to do that, those people who represented Japan's future. And so we had this terrific action with America, which at that time was rising on that ideal, following Lincoln. And so the two countries very naturally worked together. They worked to get around Lincoln, around the British, who were continuing to menace China. And also the French. The French government was an empire at that time, Napoleon III. American technology, locomotives, engineering advisors, and other things were availed of. The Japanese students came here. People studied economics. The works by Carey and the American nationalists were translated. Hamilton was translated. Friedrich List. So they were guided in this takeoff period by, when people say the West, this is largely the ideas of the legacy of Franklin and the best of the West, which at that time was American. After this initial period, Japan on its own made astonishing progress and showed a genius, which I believe could be shown by every country. Maybe it will take longer in some other countries because they don't have this previous record of accomplishment that existed in Japan. But this showed the world that any country that is behind the rest of the world could jump up and get into the forefront of the world. But it was very famous that Japan at that time was a great American ally and was beneficial to the world. It gave an image of just precisely what Lincoln was driving at in his speech about malice towards none and charity for all. Japan was a great example of that.
Thank you, Anton. Bob, you have a question? Bob, you might be on mute.
Yes, he's on mute.
You are certainly on mute, Bob. All right. So we'll call on Bob after. You might still have to figure this out.
Unmute.
Satomi has been waiting for a while.
Okay.
Satomi, are you
She's
still
on
there?
mute also. On mute.
I have to unmute. Oh, okay. Well, thank you very much, Anton, for your, great information of history. But, and I just want to say that I do kind of empathize with General Palmer, that conflict that you have. But I just want to bring Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who, he died at the hands of the Nazis, and he had that choice to go and teach in America or become part of the underground resistance. But I like this comment he made. He said, the peculiar evil of our time is not in the sins of the good, but in the virtues of the evil. Because, like he was saying, there are many people, they can do such good, but I mean, behind a lot of their agenda, it's just amazing that they don't have a ting of conscience. And I think this is really where the real evil lies. And, they try to, the left and many of the media try to slander the conservatives, but, and they never take into account, and then they praise the good of people like the Clintons and other people. So, so I'm just saying sometimes, you have to be a living martyr. You have to kind of make that choice to stand up and defend what you believe. And sometimes that, it's kind of like in self-defense, you protect yourself. I don't know what you think of that.
Absolutely. I believe, I certainly believe in self-defense and in the defense of a country. I think that right now would be a good time. This is before World War III. Does that mean we're going to have World War III? Or is it just before World War III would have happened? Let's compare that to World War II. Could World War II have been prevented? People say, well, wouldn't you have fought Hitler? Well, I wouldn't have fought Hitler if Hitler had been stopped before the war. I wouldn't need to fight Hitler, would I? Well, who's Hitler now? I have people that are very close to me who, when I would say something against the prospect of war, this person would say, well, you have to stand up to evil. Look at what happened when we didn't stand up to Hitler soon enough. Wouldn't you have fought Hitler? And so who's Hitler now? What was the menace of Adolf Hitler? Well, the way you think about Hitler, it was the cruel things that he did. The way that he made people, stupid and follow him without questioning, things like that. But what about the way Hitler's menace was seen by the world at the time? He was building up a massive military, and their avowed purpose as a government was to take over a large part of the world. They started to take over other countries. They menaced countries all over the world, and they made an alliance with like-minded people in Japan and Italy and other countries, and even inside France and other countries. So the menace was attacking other countries and saying that other countries' sovereignty and existence was not, did not exist. They had no right to sovereignty. Only the race or the superior civilization of the Nazis and of German race had rights. Well, Who says that today? The Anglo-Americans say that in many ways. I think that's the menace to the world. I think that the globalist system and ideology is that menace right now. I think that Russia and China, with the faults that they have, I don't admire dictatorships. I don't admire ruthless methods, if there are such ruthless methods. I know there are some ruthless methods in Russia. I'm not sure about China. There's a lot of surveillance. I think all of that's irrelevant. What they're doing in the world today is the most admirable interventions of any country. They stand for sovereignty of countries, peaceful relations between countries, and the legitimacy of a government in its own country, like Syria. They were invited, Russia was invited into Syria. The United States was not. Britain was not. So I think we should prevent war before it starts. If we have a war, it's in the modern era, at this point, it's our fault. Don't say, well, we have to fight so-and-so because they did something. Where were you when that was building up? Don't say you weren't around or something, or you didn't know about it. We know about this, World War III. We know about that already. There's that, to me, that's the answer. I don't think that self-defense is relevant in a certain sense. Yes, you need to defend yourself, but to me, defending yourself is preventing the war. You had this war in Europe for centuries between different religions, and they had revenge all the time until they finally decided in 1648 that by taking revenge on the other people, you were killing your own family and your own country, and it's your fault, despite the crimes of the other side. So in a sense, in the modern era, self-defense is not an excuse. It's like in a community, some guy sees a break-in to his house, and it's somebody on drugs, and he's coming in and he's coming in to brutalize the family. And so he takes out a machine gun that he has under his bed, and he kills 3 gang members who come into his house. Is that good? I don't think that's good. That's not the right question. Why does that exist? Why are there gang members running around? Where did that come from? How is that happening? It's still happening to the next family. Don't talk about your self-defense. I'm sympathetic to that individual story, but you haven't talked about the problem at all. You haven't dealt with it, right? Is it good to have a machine gun in your house and kill people? I don't think that's good. It's obviously not good for some dope-crazed person to come in and brutalize your family, obviously. But it's not a good conversation. It's not, you're not enlightening at all. You're lying when you just leave it at that.
Well, I think we have to do both, though. You know, of course, get to the root of that problem, which is, with drugs, what is our addiction? How do we prevent every kind of addiction? And I know Gabor Mate, who's a great Canadian, has dealt really quite deep in that problem with the addiction in the east side of Vancouver, where I live. But we have to do both too. I mean, I'm not going to have someone come in and kill my, family.
Oh yeah, no. Anton was not saying don't kill the person coming in to kill your family. He's saying that it's not a good thing. And there's often people get so locked into the myopic issues.
You have to resist
there's
evil.
A broader, huh?
Yeah.
You have to resist evil, obviously.
Of course, I think we could all agree if somebody's coming in to brutalize your family, you do what you got to do. That's not what's being discussed, but there's a broader context philosophically that has to be addressed.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So I think, Anton, I know your time is limited. We have Bob who's been waiting. I think Bob figured out his mute problem, and I think Sergio has a thought he wanted to share. So Bob, can you get off of mute? Bob always has something quite intelligent to say, and I hope that he's able to.
I don't see Bob's.
Oh, did he drop off? Oh, Bob dropped off. Okay. All right. And Sergio is telling me he's far away from his computer. I think Sergio just had a thought regarding the current danger of nuclear war today and the conflict between great powers, which obviously he sent me a little link to a new war game that'll be played out between June 28th and July 10th, where the U.S. Will lead 32 countries in naval exercises, very antagonistic to Russia in the Black Sea. So yeah, I think he wanted to just bring people's awareness to the real danger of World War and the importance to rediscover and really take seriously your messages and lessons of the past, and how the U.S. has to discover this forgotten good quality of its history in order to be able to break free from this trajectory. So I think we can say more about that later on in the week. Anton, I think for now we're out of questions, and I'm sure you've given us a lot to think about. Do you have any parting words you'd like to leave people with?
Yes, I need help. I would like to recruit, I suppose, particularly a young person, but anybody young in spirit, I suppose, would do. Anybody with energy, but I need help. I'm not just asking from this group of people, but if anybody has any suggestions, I have very limited resources. I have very limited time. I'm fully occupied with certain problems here. And so, and I'm working as diligently as I can to make some breakthroughs with this second volume. I just recently put out a challenge to hundreds of professors for a debate on the subject of slavery, saying that slavery, I'm challenging their lie that slavery was beneficial to the United States. You can, maybe you could, I think you must have gotten this challenge, right? Matt, did you see that?
No, I missed that.
Oh, okay. I'll send it out to you. You could send it around to people, but you could anyway. So I need to get help with research, in particular, as well as other things, but primarily with research. People who are interested in learning something about history that I might be able to teach them at the same time as they make their own discoveries and help me to put together stuff for this book. So if anybody has any ideas about this, it's pretty a universal subject, right? That if you just look at the title of the book, Universal Progress. So with that, I'll have to say goodbye then.
No, that's good. That's good. And so anybody, I think, looking to get an internship as a Anton Chaitkin research assistant, I think that's a really wonderful opportunity to really make some discoveries and build up your insights. So you could write to, if you're watching this on YouTube, you can write to info@risingtidefoundation.net if you're interested. Similarly, if you want to just participate in the live seminars, which we do every Sunday, next week will be Marty Seif, who will be going through Lincoln's genius, Lincoln's statecraft, and his relationship to Shakespeare as well. Next week, probably at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Anton, thank you enormously once more for giving of your discoveries and sharing that with all of us. Thank you everyone for joining us on this hot, smoldering, sunny summer day.
Thanks, Anton.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you so much, Anton.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anton. Wonderful.